The question the world never heard. Keanu Reeves had learned how to live with silence in a way few people ever do. Not the empty silence of loneliness, but the heavy, thoughtful kind. The kind that settles in after years of loss, reflection, and choosing kindness when bitterness would have been easier. On the outside, the world saw a man who smiled softly, spoke gently, and moved through fame without clinging to it. On the inside, there was a lifetime of memories he rarely spoke about, and questions he never answered out loud, especially the one that followed him everywhere he went. Why never marriage? That question had chased him across decades, across movie sets and red carpets, across interviews where hosts tried to sound casual while probing something deeply personal. He always deflected with grace. He joked. He smiled. He redirected the conversation toward art, gratitude, or the beauty of ordinary life. But the truth was more complex than a soundbite and far heavier than most people realized. Marriage, to Keanu, was not an institution he disrespected. It was something he treated with such seriousness that he feared touching it at all. On one quiet evening in Los Angeles, long after the city lights had softened and the noise had faded into a distant hum, Keanu sat alone on his balcony, the cool night air brushing against his face. Below him, traffic moved like a slow river of light. Above him, the sky was unusually clear. Nights like this always stirred old thoughts, about love that had come and gone, about promises that felt sacred, and about whether protecting others from pain sometimes meant denying yourself happiness. He held a cup of untouched tea in his hands when his phone vibrated. One message, short, familiar. "Are you up?" He smiled before he even replied. Sandra Bullock had always had a strange way of knowing when to reach out. It was never dramatic, never intrusive. Just a quiet check-in that felt like someone gently knocking on the door of your thoughts and saying, "I see you." "Yeah," he typed back, "can't sleep." A pause, then her reply appeared. "Me neither, wanna talk." They had known each other for decades, long enough to move past pretenses, long enough to understand when conversation was about more than words. Their friendship had survived time, distance, separate lives, and the strange pressure of public imagination. People had spent years writing stories about them, imagining endings that never happened, filling in blanks that neither of them ever felt the need to correct. But what most people didn't understand was that what they shared didn't need a label to be real. They met at a small, unremarkable cafe tucked away from the usual Hollywood paths, a place where no one stared and no one asked questions. Sandra arrived first, her hair pulled back, her posture relaxed but alert, like someone who had learned how to carry both strength and vulnerability without apology. When Keanu walked in, she looked up and smiled, not the smile she gave cameras, but the one reserved for people who felt like home. They talked at first about nothing important, about work, about a book she'd been reading, about a motorcycle ride he'd taken earlier that week. The rhythm was easy, familiar, comforting, but there was something beneath the surface tonight, something both of them felt circling closer. Sandra stirred her drink slowly, then looked up at him, not casually, not teasingly, but with honesty. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He nodded, already knowing this wasn't a light question. "Do you ever think about marriage?" The word hung in the air, heavier than it should have been. Not because it was forbidden, but because it was rarely spoken between them. Keanu didn't answer right away. He didn't look away either. He simply breathed in, steady and slow, the way he always did when he was deciding whether to speak from the surface or from the truth. "All the time," he said finally, "just not the way people expect." Sandra didn't interrupt. She had learned long ago that silence was part of how he spoke. "I think people assume I don't believe in it," he continued, his voice calm but weighted. "That I'm afraid of commitment, that I chose solitude, but that's not it." He paused, then added quietly, "I believe in love so deeply that I'm careful with it." She leaned back slightly, absorbing his words. "I've seen how fast life can change," he said. "How love can exist one moment and disappear the next. I know what it's like to lose something you thought was permanent. And when you know that kind of pain, you start asking yourself whether it's kinder to hold on or kinder to let go before someone else gets hurt." Sandra watched him closely now. This wasn't an interview answer. This wasn't the public Keanu. This was the man who rarely allowed himself to be fully seen. "So you stayed away," she said softly. "I stayed respectful," he corrected gently. "I stayed honest. I didn't want to promise something I wasn't sure the universe would let me keep." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, a car passed. Inside, the cafe felt suspended in time. Then Sandra did something unexpected. She smiled, not sadly, not wistfully, but warmly. "You know," she said, "the world calls you lonely because it doesn't understand peace." He looked at her, surprised. "They think being alone is the same as being empty," she continued. "But I've never thought that about you. I've always thought you were full, just quiet about it." Something in his expression shifted. Not pain, not regret, recognition. "And you," he asked, "did you ever want it? Marriage, I mean." Her smile softened. "I did," she admitted. "Once, maybe more than once, but timing is a strange thing. Sometimes it's not that love isn't there, it's that life isn't ready." Their eyes met, and for a fleeting second the past brushed against the present. Not as longing, not as regret, just as understanding. Sandra broke the moment with a small laugh. "You know, people have spent years saying we were the story that never happened." Keanu chuckled quietly. "Yeah, I've seen that headline too." "And," she asked lightly, "and maybe," he said thoughtfully, "some stories aren't meant to be loud, maybe they're meant to be steady." The waitress came by, refilled their cups, and left without a word, as if sensing the fragility of the space between them. When Sandra finally stood to leave, Keanu reached for his wallet, but she stopped him with a look. "Let me," she said, "consider it my contribution to an honest conversation." Outside, the night air had cooled. The city felt distant again. As they stood there, neither quite ready to walk away, Sandra reached out and lightly touched his hand. "You said love doesn't need promises," she said quietly. "Maybe that's true, but maybe it still deserves courage." He looked at her hand on his, then back at her face. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he smiled, the kind of smile that comes from someone realizing a door has opened, even if he hasn't stepped through it yet. "Maybe," he said softly. As they parted ways, neither of them knew what the world would eventually make of that conversation. But somewhere deep inside, something had shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, just enough to matter. And in the days to come, when Keanu would finally speak publicly about marriage, not as an idea, but as a truth shaped by loss and hope, what Sandra Bullock would say next would leave everyone stunned, not because it was romantic, but because it was real. The truth he never meant to say out loud. Keanu Reeves did not sleep that night. After leaving the cafe, he rode his motorcycle through the quiet streets of Los Angeles, letting the cool wind press against his chest as if it might still the thoughts racing through his mind. The city looked different at that hour, less demanding, less curious, stripped of its hunger for explanations. Traffic lights blinked patiently, storefronts rested behind darkened glass, and for the first time in a long while, Keanu felt as if the world was not asking anything from him. Yet inside, something had been stirred, something he had kept carefully contained for years. Sandra's words echoed again and again, not because they were dramatic, but because they were true. Maybe love still deserves courage. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a request. It was simply an invitation to stop guarding the past so tightly that the present had no room to breathe. When he finally returned home, the sky was already beginning to pale. Dawn crept slowly over the horizon, casting soft light across the quiet rooms of his house. He stood still for a long time, helmet in his hand, listening to the silence he had once chosen as protection. That silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt unfinished. As he set his helmet down, his eyes drifted toward an old wooden desk in the corner of the room, a place he rarely opened anymore. Inside one of its drawers lay things he had written but never sent, thoughts that belonged to moments when honesty felt too risky and restraint felt safer. He hadn't planned to open it. His body moved before his mind could stop it. The drawer slid open with a soft sound, revealing a stack of folded papers, edges worn by time. His fingers hesitated, then closed around one envelope in particular. He didn't need to read the name written on it to know who it was for. He had written it years ago, during a time when connection felt both beautiful and dangerous, when the line between friendship and something deeper was thin enough to frighten him. He unfolded the paper slowly, the sound of it almost too loud in the quiet room. Reading his own words after so many years felt like listening to a younger version of himself, someone more hopeful, more afraid, and far less certain that silence was the right choice. He didn't finish the letter. He didn't need to. The feeling it carried was still alive, still present, still unresolved. Carefully, he folded it back and placed it on the desk instead of returning it to the drawer. That alone felt like an act of courage. Across the city, Sandra Bullock sat on her back porch, a mug of coffee warming her hands as the morning light filtered through the trees. The city was waking up, but she felt suspended somewhere between yesterday and whatever came next. She hadn't expected their conversation to linger the way it did, but honesty has a way of refusing to be ignored once it's spoken. She thought about Keanu's face as he talked, not guarded, not performative, but open in a way that made her chest tighten. People had spent years speculating about them, inventing stories, projecting romance or regret, but none of those narratives captured what she had felt sitting across from him that night. It wasn't about what they were to each other. It was about how deeply they understood the cost of love. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her, messages from her publicist, headlines already forming. Reeves opens up about marriage in rare private conversation. She sighed softly. The world was always hungry for confessions, even when they weren't meant to be public. She didn't respond. Instead, she let her mind wander back to the look in his eyes when he said he stayed unattached, not because he didn't believe in love, but because he believed in it too much. That wasn't something people could easily turn into gossip. It was too human, too quiet. Later that afternoon, Sandra found herself driving without a destination, letting instinct guide her through familiar streets. She recognized the turn before she consciously decided to take it, her hands moving on the steering wheel as if memory itself were in control. When she parked, she sat there for a moment, heart beating just a little faster than usual. Showing up unannounced wasn't her style, not anymore. But something about unfinished conversations has a way of pulling you forward. When Keanu opened the door, surprise flickered across his face before softening into a small, genuine smile. There was no awkwardness, no need for explanations. He stepped aside and let her in as if she had always been welcome there. The house was quiet, simple, untouched by excess. It reflected him perfectly. As they stood there, neither rushed to speak. Sometimes the most meaningful conversations begin without words. "I couldn't stop thinking about last night," she said finally, her voice steady but honest. "Me neither," he replied. They sat across from each other, the afternoon light spilling gently through the windows. Sandra's eyes drifted toward the desk, where the envelope lay in plain sight. She noticed the way his gaze followed hers, the way his shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly. "What's that?" she asked softly. He hesitated, then exhaled. "Something I wrote a long time ago." "For me?" she asked, not accusing, not demanding, just curious. He nodded. The room seemed to hold its breath. When she read the letter, she didn't cry, she didn't smile either. She simply absorbed it, every line settling somewhere deep inside her. When she finished, she looked up at him, eyes bright with emotion he hadn't expected. "You didn't send this because you didn't want to disrupt my peace," she said gently. "But you should know something, you never disrupted it, you added to it." He looked away, shaken more by her kindness than by any accusation could have been. "I thought staying quiet was the respectful thing," he said. "Sometimes it is," she replied, "and sometimes silence protects fear more than love." The weight of her words lingered between them, not as pressure but as truth. Outside, the day moved on as usual. Inside, something fundamental was shifting. This wasn't a reunion. It wasn't a declaration. It was something far more fragile and far more real, a moment where two people allowed honesty to exist without demanding a conclusion. As Sandra stood to leave, she paused at the door. "The world is going to talk," she said calmly. "They always do." Keanu nodded. "I know." "But whatever they say," she added, meeting his eyes, "doesn't change what was real in that room last night." After she left, Keanu stood alone again, but the silence felt different now. It wasn't a wall. It was a space, one that finally had room for possibility. And soon, when the world would hear him speak openly about marriage in his own words, without deflection or disguise, it wouldn't be the confession that shocked everyone. It would be what Sandra chose to say in response, a truth so grounded and unexpected that it would quiet the noise instead of feeding it. When silence finally spoke back, the day the story escaped into the world did not begin with chaos. It began quietly, almost gently, the way life often does before it changes shape. Keanu Reeves woke early, as he often did, the morning light slipping through the curtains and settling across the room like a reminder that time never waits for certainty. He brewed coffee, fed the familiar routines that kept his mind steady, and tried not to think about the conversation that would soon take place later that evening. He had agreed, reluctantly but honestly, to sit down for a rare, long-form interview, not to promote a film, not to sell a story, but to answer a question he had avoided for years. Not because he owed anyone an explanation, but because for the first time, the truth no longer felt like something he needed to protect from the world. It felt like something he needed to stop protecting from himself. The interview studio was calm, deliberately understated, designed to feel more like a conversation than a performance. Keanu sat across from the host with his usual composed presence, hands folded loosely, posture relaxed, eyes attentive. They spoke first about art, about aging in an industry obsessed with youth, about gratitude and loss. The questions were thoughtful, respectful, patient. And then, inevitably, the conversation turned toward the subject everyone was waiting for: marriage. Not framed as gossip, not framed as pressure, but as curiosity. The host asked him what it truly meant to him after everything he had lived through. Keanu did not smile this time. He did not deflect. He paused long enough for the silence to stretch, long enough for the audience to feel that something real was coming. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but unguarded in a way few people had ever heard. He said marriage to him was never about fear of commitment, never about avoiding love. It was about reverence. He spoke of love as something fragile and sacred, something that deserved presence more than promises, honesty more than spectacle. He admitted that after loss, he had learned how quickly life can take what you treasure, and that the idea of standing before someone and promising a forever he could not control felt heavier than walking alone. Not because he didn't want to share life, but because he respected how much it could hurt when shared life is taken away. The room was silent when he finished. There was no applause, no dramatic reaction, just stillness, the kind that follows truth when it lands exactly where it needs to. The clip went live within hours, shared across platforms, dissected by headlines desperate to turn nuance into simplicity. Some called it heartbreaking, some called it profound, some tried to twist it into loneliness, but something unexpected happened alongside the noise. People listened, truly listened. And for many, his words felt like permission to grieve honestly, to love carefully, to admit that strength does not always look like certainty. Sandra Bullock watched the interview alone in her living room. The sound turned low, her full attention on his face rather than his words. She recognized the subtle shifts in his expression, the moments where he chose vulnerability over safety. She knew how much it cost him to speak that openly. When the clip ended, she sat still for a long time, phone resting in her hand, messages already flooding in from friends, colleagues, and people who assumed they knew what his words meant. They asked what she thought. They asked if she had seen it. They asked if the rumors were true. She didn't answer any of them. Instead, she replayed one line over and over in her mind. Love deserves presence more than promises. It wasn't a rejection of marriage. It was a definition of love that had been shaped by pain, care, and deep responsibility. And she understood something then that surprised even her. The world was about to interpret his honesty as closure, but for her, it sounded like an opening. Later that night, she drove without telling anyone where she was going, the city lights blurring softly as emotions she hadn't named in years rose quietly to the surface. When she arrived at his place, she didn't hesitate. She knocked once firmly, decisively, as if she had already made peace with whatever awaited on the other side of the door. Keanu opened it looking tired, thoughtful, unsurprised. He knew why she was there before she said a word. "I saw it," she said simply. He nodded. "I figured you would." For a moment they stood there, the weight of public attention hovering just outside the door, unable to cross the threshold. Inside, the air felt different, charged but calm, like a storm that had already passed. Sandra stepped in, setting her keys down slowly, her movements deliberate, grounded. "You didn't soften it," she said quietly. "You didn't hide." "I didn't want to," he replied. "Not anymore." She looked at him, really looked at him, and something in her expression shifted from concern to resolve. "They're going to misunderstand," she said. He shrugged gently. "They always do." "Yes," she said, stepping closer, her voice steady but emotional. "But this time I don't think you should be the only one speaking." He frowned slightly, not in confusion but in surprise. "What do you mean?" She took a breath, as if steadying herself before stepping onto uncertain ground. "I think I should say something too." The room seemed to grow quieter, as if the walls themselves were listening. Keanu didn't respond right away. He wasn't afraid of what she might say. He was afraid of what it might cost her. "You don't owe anyone an explanation," he said gently. "I know," she replied. "This isn't for them." She explained then, slowly and carefully, that she wasn't interested in confirming rumors or denying stories. She didn't want to frame their connection as romance or nostalgia or destiny. What she wanted was to protect the truth he had just shared from being reduced to a headline. She wanted people to understand that love doesn't always follow the same script, that companionship can be profound without being conventional, that care can be deep without being loud. "What if I say the wrong thing?" she asked quietly. He looked at her with that familiar softness, the kind that had always made her feel seen. "Then you'll still be honest," he said, "and that's never wrong." They sat together then, side by side, not touching, not avoiding each other either. Outside, the world kept speculating. Inside, they were deciding something far more important. Sandra realized that what shocked people wouldn't be a confession of romance or a declaration of love. What would truly unsettle expectations was something far simpler and far rarer. Two people choosing honesty over narrative, humanity over mythology. By the time she left that night, they both knew the next step would change how the world saw them. But for the first time, neither of them felt the need to control that vision. Whatever Sandra was about to say, it wouldn't rewrite the past. It would clarify the present. And when she finally spoke, calmly, deliberately, without spectacle, it would silence far more than it stirred. The answer no one expected. The morning Sandra decided to speak did not feel dramatic to her. There was no rush of adrenaline, no sense of standing on the edge of something dangerous. Instead, there was a calm certainty she hadn't felt in years, the kind that settles in only after you've spent a long time listening to your own thoughts and finally stopped arguing with them. Sandra Bullock woke before her alarm, sunlight filtering gently into the room, and for the first time since the interview aired, she did not reach for her phone immediately. The noise could wait. The opinions could wait. What mattered was clarity, and clarity does not come from scrolling through other people's interpretations of your life. She made coffee, sat quietly at the kitchen table, and let herself think. Not about headlines, not about fans, not about the stories people had been telling about her and Keanu Reeves for decades, but about the man she knew beyond all of that. She thought about the way he listened more than he spoke, the way he carried grief without letting it turn into bitterness, the way his kindness was never strategic and never public unless it had to be. Most of all, she thought about the courage it had taken for him to speak honestly about marriage in a world that prefers easy explanations over uncomfortable truth. Her publicist had left several messages overnight, all carefully worded, all urging caution. Say something short, say something neutral, say nothing at all. Sandra listened to them later, thanked her, and then gently set those suggestions aside. She wasn't angry at the advice, she understood it. But she also understood something deeper. If she stayed silent now, the silence would not protect the truth. It would distort it. By midday, the internet had turned Keanu's words into symbols that suited whatever people already believed. Some called him tragic, some called him broken, others painted him as a romantic martyr who had given up on happiness. Sandra felt a quiet ache reading those interpretations, not because they were cruel, but because they were incomplete. They missed the point. His words weren't about giving up. They were about choosing care over performance. And she knew that if she spoke, she had to speak in a way that honored that distinction. She didn't choose a glossy interview or a dramatic appearance. She chose a small, trusted space, the same kind Keanu had chosen, a simple recorded conversation, minimal production, no grand framing. When the camera turned on, she didn't adjust her posture or rehearse a smile. She sat as she was, grounded, composed, and unmistakably sincere. She began by acknowledging the noise without feeding it. She said she had seen the conversations happening around Keanu's words and that she understood why people were curious. Curiosity, she said, is human. But she gently reminded the audience that curiosity becomes distortion when it forgets empathy. Then she spoke about him, not as a rumored partner, not as a co-star from the past, but as a person she had known for a very long time. She said she had watched him carry loss with humility, that she had seen him choose kindness even when life had given him every excuse not to. She spoke about respect, not as a romantic gesture, but as a foundation. And then she said the words that no one expected, not because they were shocking, but because they refused to follow the script people were waiting for. She said that Keanu was not afraid of marriage. He was not avoiding love. He was honoring it. She explained that some people measure commitment by ceremonies and timelines, while others measure it by presence, care, and consistency over time. Neither was wrong, she said, but misunderstanding one for the other causes unnecessary cruelty. She added that loving deeply does not always mean choosing the same path everyone else walks, and that choosing a quieter path does not mean choosing loneliness. Then she spoke about herself, not defensively, not nostalgically, but honestly. She said she had loved in her life, lost in her life, and learned that timing is not a failure. It is a reality. She admitted that what she shared with Keanu had never needed to be defined to be meaningful. It had survived years precisely because it wasn't forced into a shape that didn't fit. And then, calmly, almost casually, she said something that seemed to stop the internet in its tracks. She said, "The most meaningful relationships in my life are the ones where no one asked me to perform happiness for an audience. They are the ones where silence felt safe." There was no declaration, no confession, no denial either, just truth. And somehow that unsettled expectations more than any romantic reveal ever could. Within hours, the response shifted. The comments were different this time. People weren't arguing about whether they were together or not. They were talking about grief, about love, about how rarely public figures speak about relationships without turning them into products. Many wrote that they felt seen, that her words had given them permission to stop explaining their own lives to people who only understood one version of happiness. Keanu watched her statement alone, sitting quietly in the same place where he had given his interview days earlier. He didn't smile immediately. He didn't cry. He simply breathed deeply and fully, the way someone does when a weight they didn't realize they were carrying is finally set down. When his phone buzzed with a message from her, "I said what felt true," he replied with just 3 words. "Thank you for staying." They met later that evening, away from cameras, away from conversations that wanted more than either of them was willing to give. There was no awkwardness between them, no sense of unfinished business demanding resolution. Instead, there was a quiet understanding that something important had been protected. Not a relationship, not an image, but the integrity of their connection. As they walked together through the soft evening light, Sandra spoke first. "They didn't get what they expected," she said with a faint smile. Keanu nodded. "Maybe that's okay." "It is," she replied, "because what they expected was a story, what we gave them was a truth." He glanced at her, gratitude evident in his eyes. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said simply. "I wanted to." The world would continue to speculate. It always would. But something had changed. The noise had lost its sharpness. In its place was a quieter conversation, one about respect, about presence, about the many ways love can exist without announcing itself. And yet, even as the world began to settle, something else was quietly unfolding beneath the surface, something neither of them had anticipated. Because sometimes, when you finally stop hiding from truth, life responds by asking one more question, one that cannot be answered with words alone. The quiet choice that changed everything. After Sandra spoke, the world did something rare. It slowed down, not completely. There were still headlines, still opinions, still people trying to frame what they had said into something familiar, but the sharp edge was gone. The hunger for spectacle had been replaced by something softer, something closer to reflection. Keanu felt it almost immediately, not as relief exactly, but as space. Space to breathe without explaining. Space to exist without correcting. For the first time in a long while, the silence around him felt earned rather than enforced. In the days that followed, he returned to routines that grounded him. Early mornings, long walks, time spent reading, thinking, letting his thoughts move without pushing them toward a conclusion. He found himself returning again and again to one realization that surprised him with its simplicity. Speaking honestly hadn't taken anything away from him. It hadn't reopened wounds the way he once feared. Instead, it had softened their edges. Pain didn't vanish, but it changed shape, becoming something that could coexist with peace rather than threaten it. Sandra felt the shift too, though hers arrived differently. Friends reached out not with questions, but with gratitude. Strangers sent messages that had nothing to do with gossip and everything to do with recognition. Women wrote about choosing lives that didn't fit expectations. Men wrote about learning that gentleness wasn't weakness. None of them asked her to define what she and Keanu were. They didn't need to. What she had offered wasn't a label, it was permission. Permission to value relationships that didn't need public validation to be real. When they met again, it wasn't planned around the aftermath of what had been said. It was planned around something far more ordinary. Dinner. No assistance. No scheduled pressure. Just 2 people who had spent decades learning how to protect others and were now learning how to protect something quieter and more fragile between themselves. The restaurant was modest, almost anonymous, the kind of place where conversations could unfold without being overheard or interpreted. They talked about small things at first. Books, music, places they still wanted to see. But eventually the conversation drifted where it always did when honesty had already cleared the ground. "You know," Sandra said thoughtfully, "for years I thought clarity meant answers, defined answers. Now I think it just means alignment." Keanu nodded slowly. Alignment with what feels true. Yes, she said, even when it's not convenient. He smiled faintly, especially then. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, but full. Keanu realized in that moment that what he felt sitting across from her wasn't urgency or longing or fear. It was steadiness, the kind that doesn't demand more but also doesn't shrink from it. For so long, he had believed that choosing caution was the same as choosing care. Now he understood that care sometimes required presence, not distance. "I've spent years making sure I didn't hurt anyone," he said quietly. "I never stopped to ask whether that meant I was also avoiding letting something good exist." Sandra didn't respond right away. She considered his words carefully, then answered with a calm that held no judgment. "Avoiding pain isn't the same as choosing safety," she said. "Sometimes it just means choosing loneliness that looks responsible." That truth settled between them, not as a challenge, but as recognition. Neither of them rushed to define what came next. They didn't need to. What mattered was the choice they were making in that moment, to stop stepping away from something simply because it didn't come with guarantees. In the weeks that followed, they found themselves spending time together in ways that felt almost deceptively normal. Long walks without conversation, shared meals without agendas, evenings where silence wasn't a gap to be filled but a space they both trusted. There was no announcement, no shift that the world could point to and say, "This is where everything changed." But for Keanu, everything had changed quietly, internally, in the way that lasts. One evening, as they sat watching the city lights from a distance, Sandra spoke a thought she had been carrying for some time. "You know what surprised me the most about all of this?" she asked. He looked at her, attentive as always. "That people thought the shocking part would be romance," she said. "But the real shock was watching two people choose honesty without demanding an outcome." He smiled, a little more openly than usual. "Maybe that's what scares people, not love, but love without control." She returned the smile, or love without performance. That night after they parted, Keanu realized something else. For the first time since loss had reshaped his understanding of the world, he wasn't bracing himself against the future. He wasn't promising it either. He was simply allowing it, and that, he understood now, was not a betrayal of what he had lost. It was an honoring of it. Love, as he was finally learning, didn't ask you to forget the past. It asked you to carry it forward with care. The world remained quieter than expected, but not silent. And somewhere within that calm, another question was forming, not from reporters or fans, but from life itself. It was a question neither of them had prepared for, because it could not be answered with philosophy or perspective alone. It would ask for action. And when that moment arrived, when the choice could no longer remain internal or unspoken, what Keanu would do, and what Sandra would say, would bring their story not to a conclusion, but to its most meaningful turning point yet. The way peace finally chose them. The moment that asked for action did not announce itself with urgency or drama. It arrived the way the most meaningful changes often do, quietly, almost respectfully, waiting to see if it would be noticed. For Keanu, it came one evening as he sat alone after a long day, the house filled with a familiar stillness that no longer felt protective, but incomplete. He realized then that for most of his life, he had treated peace as something that required distance. Distance from attachment, distance from expectation, distance from the possibility of pain. Yet now, after everything that had been said and understood, that same peace was asking for closeness instead. Not recklessness. Not promises made out of fear of losing time. Just presence, the kind that stays when walking away would be easier. He thought about all the years he had believed that love meant enduring loss quietly, carrying it without complaint, and making sure it never harmed anyone else. He understood now that there was another form of responsibility he had overlooked, allowing connection to exist honestly when it presented itself without demand. The courage Sandra had shown, not by declaring anything, but by refusing to let truth be twisted, had made something clear to him. Choosing to stay emotionally available was not a betrayal of his past. It was a continuation of what that past had taught him. When they met again, it was not to discuss the future or define anything. They walked together through a park just outside the city, autumn beginning to soften the edges of the trees, leaves shifting underfoot with each step. The world around them felt distant, unintrusive. No one was watching. No one was waiting for an outcome. That absence of pressure felt almost sacred. "I've been thinking," Keanu said eventually, his voice steady, thoughtful, "about what you said about alignment." Sandra glanced at him, her expression open, unguarded. "And And I realized something, he continued. I don't need certainty to choose presence, I just need honesty. She stopped walking then, not abruptly, but with intention, turning to face him fully. And what does honesty look like to you right now? He didn't rush the answer. He had learned that rushing was usually a sign of fear. It looks like not stepping away from something meaningful just because it doesn't come with instructions, he said. It looks like letting care exist without trying to control where it leads. She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. That sounds like peace, she said. It feels like it, he replied. They didn't mark that moment with a decision or a declaration. They didn't call it a beginning or an ending. They simply continued walking, side by side, the space between them natural and unforced. And somehow that choice, to keep moving forward together without demanding definition, felt more deliberate than any vow ever could. In the weeks that followed, their lives settled into a rhythm that felt almost invisible to the outside world. They spent time together, but not constantly. They respected each other's independence, their need for solitude, their private ways of processing the world. What changed was not how often they saw each other, but how present they were when they did. Conversations deepened. Silences grew comfortable. The sense of guarding something fragile faded, replaced by the quiet confidence that it no longer needed protection from itself. There came a day when Sandra said something that stayed with him long after the moment passed. They were sitting quietly, watching the light shift across the room as afternoon turned toward evening when she spoke without looking at him. You know, she said softly, I don't think love is about asking someone to stay forever. I think it's about choosing to stay today honestly. He turned toward her, understanding settling in. Then today feels like a good choice, he said. She smiled, not brightly, not dramatically, but with a calm warmth that carried no expectations. It does. The world inevitably moved on. New stories replaced old ones. Attention shifted elsewhere. And in that fading noise, something rare happened. What remained was real, no longer shaped by speculation or defended by silence, but lived quietly, deliberately, without explanation. Keanu found that peace no longer felt like something he had to guard. It felt like something he shared. One evening, as they stood together watching the city lights from a distance, Sandra spoke again, her voice thoughtful. People will probably keep asking what this is. He smiled gently. They always will. And will never really answer, she said, more amused than resigned. Because it's not theirs, he replied. She nodded, satisfied. Exactly. In that moment, Keanu understood something that had taken him a lifetime to learn. Love was not a promise made to the future. It was a choice made in the present. Marriage was not a symbol of courage or fear. It was simply one of many paths people take toward connection. And choosing a different path did not make love smaller. Sometimes it made it truer. As night settled around them, neither felt the need to speak again. The silence they shared was no longer a shield. It was a home.